Okay, it's 9:30, so let's go ahead and kick off this conversation. Good morning, and thank you for joining us to discuss the factual findings and the legal analysis of PILPG's report on atrocity crimes committed against the Rohingya in Myanmar's Rakhine State. I'm Paul Williams. I'm the co-founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, the organization responsible for the in-the-field investigation of the atrocity crimes, as well as for the preparation of the factual report, and then separately the publication of the legal report. Now, we've combined the factual report and the legal report into one document to make it easier to digest. The Public International Law and Policy Group, as many of you know, is a global pro bono law firm that provides free legal assistance to parties engaged in peace negotiations, drafting post-conflict constitutions, and prosecuting war criminals. PILPG has worked with over 24 countries in the last 25 years on peace negotiations, many of which involved questions of transitional justice. We've also worked with over 24 countries on post-conflict constitutions, and we have provided pro bono legal assistance to every single international criminal tribunal, as well as every hybrid tribunal engaged in the prosecution of war crimes. Now, in March and April of 2018, PILPG, at the request of the Department of State, undertook an unprecedented, large-scale, comprehensive human rights documentation investigation mission in the refugee camps and the settlement areas in eastern Bangladesh, entailing 1,024 interviews with Rohingya refugees. We provided a qualitative and a quantitative report to the Department of State. The factual findings of PILPG's investigation mission formed the basis for the State Department's recently released report on human rights violations against the Rohingya, titled Documentation of Atrocities in the Northern Rakhine State. Separately, and on its own accord, PILPG pulled together a team of international lawyers to assess this data to determine whether there was a reasonable basis to believe that the abuses perpetrated against the Rohingya by the Myanmar armed forces amounted to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It is clear from our intense legal review that there is, in fact, a legal basis to conclude that the Rohingya were the victims of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. As such, we believe there is sufficient basis to bring international criminal proceedings against the perpetrators of this violence and recommend that the international community pursue legal accountability for the atrocity crimes committed in the Rakhine State against the Rohingya. Such an assessment is not to be made lightly and must be subject to appropriate scrutiny. To walk you through our investigative work in the field, the preparation of our qualitative and quantitative report, and our legal findings, we have assembled today members of our various teams who conducted this work. I will first turn the floor over to Nina Bong Jensen, and I'll do the introductions of everyone discussing their background and what they'll talk about, and then we'll turn it back to Nina to kick it off. So I will first turn it to Nina, who served as an expert advisor on both the factual and the legal reports. Nina is the former executive director of the Coalition for International Justice, which was heavily engaged in seeking justice and accountability for the atrocities committed in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, East Timor, Cambodia, and Sudan. Notably, Nina and the Coalition for International Justice led the effort to conduct and to gather over 1,200 interviews of the Darfuris seeking to answer the question of what atrocity crimes had been committed in Darfur. Nina will describe the process behind assembling our investigation team of 18 experienced investigators from nearly a dozen countries and the decisions involved in developing our methodology to ensure that we secured first-hand accounts from a random sample that was representative of the refugee population. We will then turn the microphone to Milica Kostic, who served as our project director and was in the field for the duration of the entire project. Milica previously worked for the Humanitarian Law Center in Belgrade, which was heavily engaged in the documentation of atrocity crimes and efforts to achieve accountability in Serbia and in Kosovo. Melissa will provide an overview of the investigative process and our factual findings. We will then turn the microphone to Dr. Gregory Noon, a member of our investigative team. Greg is a captain in the U.S. Naval Reserve JAG. He's the director of the Fairmont State University National Security and Intelligence Program and the former head of the International and Operational Law Division at the Navy JAG. His views are his own. Greg will share his experience on the ground, including some of his immediate impressions of the violence recounted by the survivors. We will then turn to Renee Katawala, who is the firm-wide pro bono counsel at Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. Renee will describe the process by which nearly 100 pro bono lawyers and staff from Orrick transformed the 15,000 pages of investigative material and the 13,000 data points into a qualitative and quantitative assessment. I should note that Orrick is ranked number 3 in the United States in terms of its pro bono time and number 6 internationally. We will then shift the discussion to the legal review of the qualitative and quantitative assessments. In order to conduct this separate review, PILPG pulled together a team of top-flight international criminal law experts with decades of experience in documenting and assessing atrocity crimes. The team of international legal experts included Nina and Greg, as well as Jim Johnson, a former Army JAG and the former Chief of Prosecutions for the Sierra Leone Tribunal who prosecuted Charles Taylor. Dr. William Shabas, who's a professor of international criminal law and human rights at Leiden University and author of the seminal text, Genocide in International Law by Cambridge University Press. William is also a former member of the Sierra Leone Truth Commission. Michael Scharf is the Dean of Case Western Reserve School of Law and was the special advisor to the prosecutor for the Cambodia Genocide Tribunal. Mike has led PILPG's efforts to provide pro bono assistance to every international criminal tribunal. And then Dr. Jane Stromseth, who's a professor at Georgetown Law School and is the former deputy to the U.S. Ambassador of War Crimes and the former senior advisor on rule of law and humanitarian policy at the Department of State. These experts contributed in a personal capacity, and their advice and opinions do not represent those of their affiliations. The expert review team also included Sandy Hodgkinson, a retired captain in the U.S. Navy JAG, former special advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and former deputy to the U.S. Ambassador for War Crimes. Sandy will walk us through how the factual findings met the standard of a reasonable basis to conclude that the Rohingya were the victims of genocide. And then Danny Fullerton, who is the program manager for the project, will wrap up with a discussion of how the factual findings support a reasonable basis to conclude that war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed and perpetrated against the Rohingya. After that, we will have 30 minutes where we will open the floor to questions. Let me now turn the floor to Nina.
Thank you, Paul. I'm Nina Bong Jensen. And as this audience knows, some of you very much firsthand, there's been a lot of extraordinary reporting by journalists about the violence in the Rakhine State over the years. And there have been some excellent documentation reports produced by very respected human rights groups and NGOs. PILPG's work here over the past year and today is very much built on the foundation of that existing work. But I thought I would start out and just talk about how this project was a little bit different and what we hope we're contributing that's a little bit different. First, and I will just tick through this, some of it is obvious to you, but number one, the scale. The number of interviews is unprecedented. The time frame, we looked at atrocities from the October 2016 period forward. And the use of the random survey methodology, which I'll attempt to explain briefly, and the types of pretty extraordinary international investigators and prosecutors that we were lucky enough to have on board. And of course, our partnership, at least on the fact-finding part of this mission, with the Department of State. So I'll start out the outset. Our mandate initially was to help design and carry out a fact-finding mission that would help determine whether the many horrific reports of atrocities against some Rohingya in Myanmar, was representative of what was happening to the population at large in Rakhine State. So simply put, our goal was to uncover what most people who fled Rakhine State experienced before and during their flight to eastern Bangladesh from the period of October 2016 forward, and then to identify commonalities and patterns. To do so, we employed what's called a random survey methodology. What that means basically is you select persons to be interviewed based on a protocol, and you have to reach a certain number of interviews for your material to be useful so you can draw reasonable conclusions that what the 1,024 interviewees experienced is representative of what happened very likely to most of the people who fled. Carrying out this kind of survey methodology, and as Paul mentioned, I was involved in a previous effort like that's a large scale sampling on the Chad-Sudan border, is difficult in a sprawling refugee camp and with informal settlements. Things move around, people move around, but it's important to try to capture the experience of people from throughout Rakhine State, and one of the ways we did it was using this protocol. It's very different from the way a human rights group or even a criminal investigation would be carried out. Typically there, an investigator would arrive at a scene after having done research, having received material, talk to local leaders, talk to local human rights groups, talk to reporters, and get some sense of what may have happened, and then work, his or her way up through interviews following what is potential evidence in order to identify perpetrators. That was not our mission here. We were not aiming at identifying specific perpetrators, but again, trying to get an overall sense of what happened. The fact that our investigators were extremely experienced and again had worked in all over the world on this kind of project, particularly with a criminal focus, turned out to be very, very useful. It was frustrating to some of them because they're very experienced and they want to follow one set of information, and if one person you talk to says, well, you should really talk to my brother, he saw more than I did, they didn't have that luxury. I mean, they didn't have the luxury of including that information in our final collected data. Indeed, just to talk a little bit about the team, as Paul promised, I was immensely proud of the people we were able to get to join this team. And we started assembling the team in late 2017. People some of whom I'd known for different projects, the Chad one I mentioned, and also the South Sudan project, and other UN tribunals, UN commissions of inquiry, very senior people from respected domestic prosecution teams from around the world were willing to drop what they were doing and go join us under difficult circumstances in Bangladesh. And they did a remarkable job. I will say also included among our team were some of the people who had the criminal investigation experience also had gender crimes experience, military and security expertise, definitely a heavy focus on the laws of armed conflict, human rights law, and psychosocial issues, which became, as you can imagine, very important. The investigative team included 18 local Rohingya and Bengali interpreters, all of whom were trained by a team member, one of our team members, who we had recruited from the ICC, someone who had done a lot of training and a lot of interpretation work. That is often, as any of you have done these kind of missions, is where a lot of them fall apart, and we were determined to focus on this issue at the very early stages of the process. And as I believe Paul mentioned, the team were people from almost 12 different countries. I'm going to forget them all, so off the top of my head, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Serbia, South Korea, New Zealand, the UK. I know I have forgotten quite a few, but you get the sense. We thought it was very important that we have people from around the world Finally, as I mentioned, I think we all believe that the success of the fact-finding mission is very attributable to the skills of the people who were on the team. I'm not saying that they were all happy about having to use this protocol and the questionnaire and such, but it was their talent and discipline at knowing that we were only collecting information that was firsthand, meaning what did the person interviewed see or hear themselves, not my brother told me this, or I heard, or that kind of thing. So the material, I feel very good about that as well. So one additional advantage of using this random survey methodology is also you're not likely to be accused of collecting information only from the refugees who were most comfortable talking to investigators, or who were most comfortable in a language or working with an interpreter, or who had talked to a lot of other investigators, or even that their stories were particularly horrible or particularly detailed. But one obvious disadvantage and frustration, again, for I'm sure quite a few of the investigators, was that you can't, you end up missing powerful narratives that way from people who have the strongest and the most detailed stories to tell. But as our next two speakers will explain, that was not a limitation here. Our investigators had no trouble finding the kind of detailed, horrific information that you have all read about. Among the 1,024 interviewees, again, selected pursuant to the random protocol, the truly horrific stories were shocking and shockingly common. So I'll turn the mic over next to Milica, who is our project manager, and then Greg, who is on the ground. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. Hold the mic in close.
Okay. Thanks, Nina. So I'm actually also going to talk a bit about the methodology, and I'm hoping it's not going to be boring. Unfortunately, I only have around 5 minutes, so I can't talk about all the aspects that I think are relevant and interesting to a lot of you. So, for example, talking about the interpretation of actually over 30 local interpreters, or the development of the questionnaire that was used in all the interviews, or the provision of psychosocial support that to all the investigation members during our time on the ground. I will actually focus on some things that are also a bit repetitive, but I think they're very important in order for you to get a better understanding of the strength of the data this report is based on, especially the legal analysis is based on. So the methodology for the mission was developed by PLPG and the State Department, and it was largely built on missions that were conducted, as Nina talked about, in Darfur and later in South Sudan. This methodology is actually a hybrid. It's a mix of criminal investigation techniques on the one hand, and then methods used in statistical surveys on the other. So when I talk about what I mean by the criminal investigation techniques, that's really used for conducting the interviews, what Nina talked about. So we had top experienced international investigators who knew how to conduct interviews, how to avoid leading questions, how to collect firsthand experiences, not hearsay. So that's the criminal investigation kind of style. But then on the other hand, we relied on statistical surveys. So we wanted to get a representative sample of the population, and the expert statisticians that we worked with determined this to be over 1,000 interviews. So over 1,000 interviews would be a representative sample of the over 700,000 people in the refugee camps. Besides that, as Nina mentioned, we wanted to collect these 1,000 statements randomly. And this is really important to have in mind. We're talking about a vast area, geographical area, and our investigators went to went to every single camp. And when I say camp, I don't mean like the big settlements. I mean, within these camps, they went to every little settlement and every sub-camp, so to say. In the end, they collected 1,024 interviews from 34 official camp areas. And this was a very elaborate system. We developed, using satellite imagery, we developed walking patterns for these camps. And then in order to ensure that our investigators not only reached all these areas, remote areas, but actually spread out through these areas and reached the entire population. And in order to do this, as I said, we used this satellite imagery, but also these special procedures that Nina referred to were developed for randomly selecting households once in the area, and then once a household was selected, members of the household were also selected at random. And I know this sounds like a lot of technicalities, but it's really, I think, on the point in order to understand what's the value and the strength of the data. And I think really this methodology is what distinguishes this documentation effort from the many others that are out there. And if you think about what are the major benefits, this is how I think everyone should read the report and the data it's based on. So first, by collecting interviews from a large population that is selected randomly, we were able to document the voices of all representative of this population. And here I, in particular, mean women. So we didn't go just to a household and ask, can someone speak to us, and then have the head of the household, usually the male, speak to us, but we were able to hear the voices of others, especially women and the elderly. Also, by spreading out through the camps, we actually didn't come across the usual problem, which is called interviewee fatigue. Most of our respondents during the interview had the opportunity for the first time ever to speak about what they witnessed or what they survived, them or their family members. Also, crucially, through this random sampling of respondents and interviews conducted by trained international investigators, we were able to remove any bias or any perception of bias from this documentation effort. And this is critical in the context of Northern Rakhine State, where the victim's narrative is so strongly challenged by the Myanmar government. And lastly, the point of everything that I'm trying to explain here is that we weren't there to document incidents. We weren't there to follow the big stories of massacres, no matter how grave and important. We were there to document the totality of experiences and events in Northern Rakhine State as seen by the refugee population. And what that means in turn really is that the report that you all got today is not sampling of big incidents that happened, big crimes. It really presents patterns that we were able to identify during the investigation mission, patterns of human rights violation that we heard about while we were there, and that's what the legal analysis is based on. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go through all of them. Greg will deal with them, but roughly speaking, we identify, I think, over 50 patterns of human rights violations that we categorized into three broad categories. So the first one being continuous human rights violations. So human rights violations that have been going on for sometimes for decades or years that aren't necessarily linked to the latest wave of violence. So here we're talking about, for example, cases of closing down mosques, denying the practice of religion, confiscation of land, different fees, extortions, etc. The second category are human rights violations, pattern of human rights violations that have been happening since October 2016. So linked to the ARSA attacks from October 2016 and the lead up to the massive violence that was happening in August 2017. So here we have, for example, mass detention, especially of youth, but also certain activities by the armed forces leading up to the mass attacks. For example, the removal of any weapons or any, I'd say, utilities, house tools that could be used as weapon for self-defense. And then finally, the patterns of the attacks of 2017, which included rape, killings, mass killings, different types that have been identified, the burning down of villages, houses, and destruction of really any life in northern Rakhine State that were populated by the Rohingya. And I will stop here and actually turn it over to Greg, who will talk more about what we've seen while we were there. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Good morning. My name is Greg Noon, and as Paul said, I have over 28 years of military service, and just as a disclaimer, my work here is in my private capacity and doesn't represent any entity that I'm associated with. I've been to 93 countries, and I've been to Afghanistan, Sudan. I was in Rwanda after the genocide. I've seen a lot of things, and so I'm a bit dispassionate, maybe a bit cold, but I was shocked by what we uncovered there. I have to admit that I was ready to hear the same story over and over again, that there would be some level of just kind of buzz throughout the camps, that everyone kind of knew their talking points. We didn't get that at all. From the first story to the second story to the third, all the way through to 1024, we heard different stories from different people, all these horrific events. The next thing that I was prepared for, as maybe being a bit cynical and jaded in my old age, is that it would be the kind of the typical. The military came, they surrounded our village, they shot the men, raped the women, and burned down the village. And I know it sounds very terrible, and it is, and I don't want to sound too much like a sociopath in accepting that, but the reality of it is that's not really how it went. From the very first story, I was shocked to find out a man was telling me about how his mother was sick. She was sick in bed. And they came into the house, and I was ready for him to tell me, and they killed my mother. But they didn't. They cut off her legs. And I had our translator, I said, wait, what did he say? And he said they cut off her legs. And of course she died. She bled to death, but they cut off her legs. And I thought, okay, this is a bit different. And as we went through, and then at the end of the day, we would get back in the vehicles after we had spread out through the camps, and there's miles and miles of camps. I mean, it's just endless when you look out from any perspective point. And we'd all reconvene and get back in the vehicles at the end of the day. And you could just see the look on all the investigators' faces that some of the stories we'd all heard for the first time. And as Nina said, these are investigators who were on the Chad border and documenting crimes in Darfur, investigators that have spent time in some of the hot spots around the world. And I guess really the level of depravity was so shocking to all of us. And to me, it was almost as if they had all been issued Iris Chang's book, Rape of Nanking, and kind of use that as a handbook on how to do what they're about to do. When I had people telling me, not once, but several times, and this happened to all the investigators, that they would rip babies from the arms of mothers and throw those babies into the fire or throw the babies into the river, it was a whole new level of what's going on? Why are they doing this? I get if you want to kill people, but now they're going to a new level. I think one of the worst stories we encountered was when they went into a village and they selected a man to select a woman to be gang raped in front of all the villagers. And then when another man tried to stop that, he was executed. And they proceeded to gang rape this woman in front of all the villagers. And there was nothing anyone could do except watch this or die. And many of them eventually did die as the village scattered. These were the typical stories. That's not the craziest story we heard. These were typical stories. I think maybe the worst story we heard was the involvement of a Buddhist monk. And this is an important point here. The military did a lot of the logistics and the kind of coordinating and the initial attack. We believe they were using grenade launchers, particularly using incendiary grenades, because every time they launched something, it would catch fire. So there was an effort to just really just kind of create chaos, destabilize the environment, and cordon it off. But the military also invited in locals. They invited in locals who weren't Rohingya to participate in this. This particular Buddhist monk cut the penises of 2 men off and then allowed them to run down the hill where they bled out and died at the bottom of the hill. When you hear that, you just think, okay, what's going on? How did we get to this point? And sadly, we don't have those answers. But the stories we heard were so different and yet so common. It was really remarkable. And I think that's what struck all the investigators, and Milica and myself both on the ground doing investigations along with the others. And that was really our biggest takeaway, was just the absolute depraved situation that the people in the Northern Rakhine State had faced at the hands of their government. So I'll leave that there, Paul.
Great. And now let's turn to Renee, who will talk about how the team pulled together these 13,000 data points and the 15,000 pages of investigative reports into a qualitative and quantitative assessment.
Thanks. So I got a call from Paul and Danny to say, can you help us kind of synthesize the tremendous investigation that was done? So our task was to read, analyze, and then put into a human rights framework the stories of these 1,024 individuals, and to allow for the creation of an analysis that ultimately was made in this report that details the factual and legal conclusions to be made about whether there's a reasonable basis to conclude that war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide were committed. So one of the first things we did was we wanted to create a very detailed way to store this information and to be able to analyze it quickly and broadly to determine what patterns, if any, existed. So we created a database of information in which our volunteers, I sent out a request one day, and I think it demonstrates the enormous interest in the private sector for doing this kind of work. I got over 100 volunteers in a firm of about 1,000 lawyers to come forward and help. So we created a very comprehensive database working with our colleagues at PLPG to allow our volunteers to input the detailed and structured information from the questionnaires. The database that we maintained contained, among other things, the following information for each of the questionnaires: general observations on the narrative that was in the questionnaires, including an assessment for each volunteer to determine whether it was credible; evidence of any of the crimes against humanity or war crimes that may have been recounted in those questionnaires. Does the narrative describe any crimes against humanity or war crimes? Then there was a specific section for each war crime or crime against humanity that the volunteer would input that detailed information. And we broke down that information, obviously, according to the different crimes that we were analyzing. So there were about 10 to 12 of those. Before our lawyers began the process of reading the questionnaires, we wanted to make sure that the information that was being inputted had a qualitative review process. Some of our lawyers had a greater knowledge of human rights law, others did not. So we had a training for all of the volunteers to ensure that they had a baseline understanding of human rights law. And then we developed a quality control process where we had 10 supervising attorneys with some experience in human rights law review a statistically significant number of the questionnaires that were inputted to ensure that the data that was being placed in this database was consistent with the questionnaires that we were reviewing. So after all of this information was inputted into this database and it was accessible to my colleagues at PLPG and also colleagues at the State Department, we were able to run reports focused on, so for example, all crimes involving, let's say, rape. You could do a search, figure out where these events took place, the specific factual detail and just kind of read them. So it made our job of analyzing the patterns of conduct simple, because we could break down the information in a very systemized way. Ultimately, then, we had the team of 10 supervising lawyers distill that information and wrote up a factual report that would later serve as a baseline for the final product you see today. And we also included some legal analysis that our lawyers made. PLPG also at the same time asked us to help with a quantitative analysis. So each of the questionnaires that were completed were essentially coded, and we were asked to record data from those questionnaires for the purposes of conducting a quantitative analysis that the US State Department conducted to determine whether atrocity crimes were committed. So for each of the interviews that the investigators conducted, there was an interview sheet where the interviewers recorded the Rohingyas' responses to a specific series of questions. While they were in the field, the interviewers were coded for purposes of flagging specific information about where the individuals fled from, what acts they experienced, and what perpetrators they may have seen commit acts. And then for each type of act or crime, and each type of potential perpetrator had a corresponding number which the interviewers would record in their coding sheets. So we took all of that kind of statistical information, put it into a database that allowed there to be sort of a quantitative element to the analysis.
Thank you, Renee. Sandy?
So I will be talking a little bit about the legal analysis of the recommendation and conclusion of PILPG that there are reasonable grounds to believe that genocide was committed against the Rohingya in the northern Rakhine state. I start by saying I'm particularly disheartened to actually have to deliver that, given that we are 70 years after the passing of the Genocide Convention, which was designed to both prevent, punish, and deter crimes of this nature from occurring. And it is disheartening that now, 70 years later, we are still looking at a case where the facts and circumstances are so exceptionally egregious that we have to actually make a analysis, a legal determination based upon that. I would say that I was extremely impressed and felt privileged to be a member of the legal experts that they assembled from PILPG for this. They're an exceptionally talented group of internationally recognized legal experts. And as I said, I was privileged to be selected as part of that. But their experience goes back decades. And I think the methodology of collecting all the facts on the ground from such a seasoned, experienced team, and then bringing in these highly recognized legal experts to really parse through the facts and try to reach reasonable conclusions, and somewhat at a distance from the emotion of being there on the ground, is a very sound way of doing it. So I would also like to say that I, similar to Greg Noon, have spent a lot of time out in the ground over the years. I've had my Washington jobs as the deputy to the ambassador to the war crimes ambassador. I've had a lot of other jobs in Washington, but I've spent time on the ground in many of the war zones, including a year in Baghdad when we were looking at the initial crimes from Saddam Hussein's regime, including helping build that court and monitoring it over the years as time passed. I spent time as the director for the international justice at the National Security Council when we were making a determination at that time as to whether or not genocide may have occurred in Darfur, and have looked through in all of the circumstances the various times when genocide may or may not have occurred. So on the legal analysis, I'd like to begin at least by acknowledging that there is no real hierarchy of crimes when it comes to genocide. There's always this desire in these terrible instances to categorize something as genocide, because once you've done that, it seems to take on a higher level of depravity or understanding in the world community. But it is of the same legal gravity as the other crimes, such as war crimes and crimes against humanity. And certainly when I've been around the world trying to work with people on how they want to respond to atrocities such as what we've heard of here, everybody always wants to say it's genocide, it's genocide, it was genocide. And as a lawyer, I've always had to help stand back and say, there are other crimes here that may be more relevant and more likely, and I think it's important to look at the facts and carefully apply them to the law as we understand it to be. So let me take a few minutes to walk through at least what has led PILPG and this team of experts to conclude that there are reasonable grounds to believe that genocide was committed. I'll give you the sort of the legal elements and a few of the facts from that. Well, first, when you try to look at genocide, there are three basic criteria that have developed over time. And these have developed from, again, its inception of the Genocide Convention, which, again, 70 years in, now has 149 states party to the Genocide Convention. But notwithstanding, genocide is also considered to be a crime under customary international law, which means you don't have to be party to the convention to have genocide applicable to acts which occur within your nation. And additionally, the ICTY and the ICTR, these two tribunals, have provided a substantial grounds of international legal jurisprudence to help us understand some of these elements. So the three elements as we have analyzed here in this report is first, and I'll speak of each of them in turn, but first, that a protected group was targeted. Second, that individuals of that group suffered prohibited acts. And we'll talk through those. And then third, that these acts were committed with an intent to destroy the protected group in whole or in part. So those are the elements of genocide as the international legal community understands them to be. And I'd like to talk about each of them here in a legal analysis format. So when you look at this first element here, that a protected group was targeted, the Rohingya do identify themselves as a distinct ethnic group within their own language and culture, even within the Rakhine state within Myanmar. And they are undoubtedly a protected group. They have their own culture, they have their own religion, they have their own identity, they have their own way of living, and certainly that fits within the definitions as we've understood them to be as an international legal community. And they were specifically targeted by the Myanmar Armed Forces because of this cultural identity. And this type of cultural identity that they had, I mean, they went to schools in some religious schools, and they had a Muslim prayer, and they had a community where they lived among themselves with their culture. They were, many of the acts which occurred were evidence against them included killing, which is a prohibited act. All sorts of killing was documented during this investigation, including shooting, stabbing, beating, drowning, burning, other violent means. Only one respondent in all of the 1,024 who were interviewed from the dozens of villages across the northern Rakhine indicated that there were no killings in his village. 1 in 1,024. So killing was rampant and killing was occurring in a variety of different ways, some of which you've heard already from Dr. Noon. Second, serious bodily and mental harm was also evident against them. There were a series of different types of acts targeting these civilians, even as they were attempting to flee, which was a really significant factor for us there. And I'll get back to that when I talk about the third element. But there was shelling and burning of civilian villages, throwing people into rivers and fires, as you've heard, raping and sexually assaulting women. All of these are prohibited acts, all of them, again, being carried out against this Rohingya population. And the third and most critical element, which I'll talk a minute about, proving genocidal intent, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a population, is always the most challenging element of this crime because it's hard to show intent. It's hard. They don't always say words that indicate that it's because who you are that I'm killing you. But when you take the facts and circumstances together, the international tribunals have been able to determine that circumstantial evidence and facts can show that genocidal intent takes place. And so in this particular case, when you looked at the investigation, in most of the attacked villages, nothing at all was spared. They bulldozed the villages. They used flamethrowers, rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, bombarded from helicopters, and demolished everything, razing entire villages to the ground. Clearly, that shows some intent to destroy in whole or in part this people's villages. In addition, as they were being displaced, mere displacement alone has not always been determined to be genocidal intent. But in this particular case, as they were fleeing the borders into Bangladesh, they were being shot as they fled. They were being killed. They were being rammed in boats and drowned. There were so many horrific incidences where the life wasn't spared even when they were fleeing. So it wasn't just displace them and get them out, it was destroy them. And those are the types of facts that you see when you are trying to look at circumstantial evidence as to whether or not there was a genocidal intent. From all of these types of facts, that was part of the conclusion. In addition, a lot of the cultural and religious aspects of their culture were specifically targeted as well. There were racial and ethnic slurs that were shouted at these individuals as they were being killed and maimed over time and raped and brutalized. There were attacks against the religious leaders, the Islamic symbols. People felt, leading up to the population that they had to pray in quiet, or that they were also one of the really difficult factors as well, as it was really hard to get food. They deprived them of the basic food they need in the lead up to all of these attacks before they occurred. So the people were starving. The prices had gone up. They weren't able to get certain types of food. They couldn't grow all their own crops. They were prevented from fishing. I mean, all of the things that would allow this population to continue to thrive and prosper was being taken away one step at a time until this final campaign, where clearly they came in and the acts were so significant and so quick that there was, certainly in the estimation of the legal experts, enough substantial evidence to show that there was a genocidal intent that occurred here.
Thank you, Sandy. Danny?
Yeah. I also just want to reiterate the point that Sandy had made about the no hierarchy of crimes in international law, and that really is the way that myself and the rest of the authors of our report that you have in front of you approached our analysis to all of the crimes as well. So we employed the same legal standard in analyzing crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes, specifically looking at the standard, as you've heard a lot of us say, the reasonable grounds to believe the crimes were committed. So this is the same standard that the ICC uses in determining whether to open an investigation. It's the same standard that international fact-finding missions, such as the one that the UN conducted, will use as well. And so by using this objective standard to walk through each of the crimes that we've outlined in the report, we are able to say quite clearly that we have strong preliminary indicators that all of these crimes have taken place and that further action is required. And while we did employ that exact same standard throughout, for some of the crimes, we actually found it went way beyond that standard. So for instance, in crimes against humanity, where you need a showing of widespread or systematic attacks directed against a civilian population with a nexus or link to the underlying prohibited acts, and if you're before the ICC, also a policy objective as well, we found that the collected documentation so strongly supported all of the elements of crimes against humanity that we felt that it went way above even the reasonable grounds to believe standard. For instance, the patterns of attacks, the multiplicity of victims across a wide geographic area and coordinated time with the cooperation between different elements of the Myanmar Armed Forces really showed that it was both widespread and systematic. It really showed a deep awareness of the perpetrators of the ongoing conflict they're participating in, their self-proclaimed clearance operation that they were committing against the Rohingya in northern Rakhine State. But it then went so much further because the Rohingya civilians were every single time the direct target of the victims. The non-Rohingya civilians in these villages were left alone. Many were evacuated prior to. The Myanmar Armed Forces would only burn down the houses of the Rohingya parts of villages when they lived together. And so really you saw that direct targeting of the civilians in all of these crimes. One of the other challenging things we did have to address on the war crimes side is the existence of an internal armed conflict, because for there to be a war crime that was largely the same underlying prohibited acts as crimes against humanity or genocide, there does need to be that conflict. So our investigation was not designed to go in and make that sort of determination about the status of ARSA or the level of conflict. And to be honest, there is very little information about that available elsewhere as well. Lots of that information is conflicting. But what our investigation did find was just so much evidence of the underlying prohibited acts, as well as all of these acts being very closely connected to in the context of the military's actions against ARSA. They'd come into the villages and make those proclamations that they were there trying to hunt down ARSA. And so while our investigation did not focus on this, nor was it designed to be able to make a conclusive determination on the status of armed conflict, we were drafting this report in the context of leading authorities that have been able to make that determination. So for instance, the UN authority, fact-finding mission, making that decision that there was sufficient level of conflict, sufficient organization within ARSA to create that. And so really just in sum, as everyone I think has said the word patterns as we've gone down the panel, and that was really the foundation of a lot of our legal analysis across the three crimes. The clear patterns of violence, the coordination, the consistency that we were seeing it across many years, across many villages, across many perpetrators, and against many victims really gave us the reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide were committed against the Rohingya. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Let's now turn the floor open to questions. Raise your hand, Sage or James will bring by a mic. Please state your name, affiliation, and wait till you get to the mic since a number of news cameras are filming this. Let's start here. And then we'll come to Simon and then back there.
Thank you so much. My name is Andrea Gillespie, and I'm with American Jewish World Service. We're a small human rights grant-making organization that provides grants to local organizations that document human rights violations. One of my questions is, given your partnership with the State Department on this, and they're previously in October when they released their own statement where they failed to describe both crimes against humanity, war crimes, or genocide. Instead, I think they called it a well-coordinated attack. How do you view your own release of this report affecting or influencing future State Department or White House administration stances on what's going on in Rakhine?
Great, thanks. I'll go ahead and take that question. My second job out of law school was in the Office of the Legal Advisor at the Department of State. And my boss at the time had told me, Paul, only do the law. I'm like, but Todd, I'm at the State Department. And he's like, only do the law. If you want your legal analysis to be taken seriously, stick with the law. And so we've taken that to heart in our three-part effort here. First, with the in-the-field investigation, we went, as Nina and Melissa laid out, to find out what happened. That we had an idea because the journalist had done some investigations, had sort of started the narrative, but we went to find just the facts. We then prepared, from the legal perspective, the qualitative and the quantitative assessment, using in part, or by using ORC, it was that objective, real lawyers who just looking at whether it met the standards, and then we brought together the international criminal lawyers to find out if it formed a reasonable basis. So we've moved the ball down the road on three very important steps. And now as lawyers, we do make a recommendation, and that is that there should be accountability, that the international community, especially in the 70th year of the Genocide Convention, should act on this to implement accountability for these atrocities. But we don't cross the line into the policy, because then that becomes the conversation instead of the narrative of the 1,024 Rohingya who told us their story and the way in which we're amplifying their story, holding to it, and then drawing a reasonable basis, or basically stating a reasonable basis for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So we're staying within our box so that as policy shapers, policy makers, and journalists move forward, the integrity of our analysis and our legal conclusions hold solid. Simon, and then back to Michelle.
Yep, so I'm Bill Ness. I'm with the International Campaign for the Rohingya. And first of all, I just want to thank you all for this incredible report and incredible body of work, both legal and factual. And I think, as you say, what we're looking to do here, our job is to take the evidence and take the analysis and turn that into changes in public policy through our, lobbying of Congress, through pressing companies not to do business with Burmese military-owned businesses, and so forth. So, and I don't want you to step out of your box because you've outlined very, very well why you need to be in that box. But again, I'd like to kind of ask you, what other ways you think that you can, help us in making those changes in public policy that we need to end genocide, and how we can better work together, building on the basis of this excellent report.
I'll take that unless anyone else wants to. I think it's one of the ways, and I know it's not usual to have a press conference and have 6 panelists at a press conference, but that gets to the core of what we're trying to do. We're trying to be, and the way that we can help in the advocacy community is to be exceptionally transparent about how we went about getting to a finding that there's a reasonable basis for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And that is to be available for those that are interested in engaging on this, to share with you how we did that legal analysis, how we conducted the investigation, what methodology we used, because we've seen that we're now at a stage where, as we may move into accountability, this is the type of information, evidence, testimony that's necessary. The first step is the journalists go to the ground and find out, is something happening? And how bad is that? The advocacy groups engage and say, we have to stop this, we have to change this. And then before you move into that higher level of accountability, you need, did it actually happen? What entities were responsible? So that you can't be flim-flammed with talking points from the perpetrators that, this was response to an insurgency, this really didn't happen, it was only a dozen folks. No, sample of 1,024, which accurately reflects the 700,000. Michelle?
Thanks, Michelle Kellerman with NPR. So were you disappointed, though, or frustrated, angry with the State Department for looking at the same evidence and not coming to that determination that it was genocide? And what difference does it really make if the government calls it genocide? I mean, they did in Darfur, and I'm not sure it made a huge difference politically. So
we did this in a number of phases. We did the in the field investigation, and then we did our qualitative and quantitative analysis, and that's the material that we provided to the Department of State. We then separately picked up a legal analysis, and so we're now coming out with our legal analysis. And I suppose Renee, as a corporate lawyer, can tell you, lawyers, we're never disappointed. We operate in an environment where we're focused on the facts, the law, and then we put it out there, and then the policy shapers, the policymakers, pick it up and add in a number of other inputs that we're not qualified to do. I'll turn it over to Sandy to be more specific on this.
Well, I just wanted to add in. I mean, as I mentioned, there's always this desire to have the genocide label attached to something, and whether that has a legal consequence or not, I think, isn't the primary question. I mean, the legal consequence is part of how we take steps to ratchet up the pressure and try to prevent and punish and deter the crime from occurring in the future, and it's helpful. But I think the determination of genocide, when it is declared to be such, does have a cathartic effect for the victims and for the victim communities. It may or may not, again, have a legal consequence that is graver than any of the others, but it conjures up this emotion, not just by the victims that what they've suffered has been given a title or a label, but it also, it conjures up a moral imperative, I think, among others to take more serious action, because this notion of, war crimes, crimes against humanity, all horrific, but when it gets to the level of a population trying to destroy the culture and history and legacy of a particular people, whether in whole or in part, there's something of a higher moral imperative, I think, that comes from that. And so while as a lawyer I could say, again, it may not result in a higher criminal sentence in a criminal case, it does seem to have an important effect for the victim community, and it seems to have a more significant effect on countries and international organizations who are dedicated to preventing these types of crimes.
And then in the back row there, James has him.
Hi, my name is Aziz Khan, and I'm from Voice of America. And my question is for the two military lawyers, Greg and Sandy, but if anyone else would like to offer their views, then they would be greatly appreciated as well. So it seems that the purpose of a legal review is twofold. One is to establish the magnitude and the nature of atrocities, and that has been very well achieved by the work that has just been presented. But there is another aspect to it, and that is to lay the blame very specifically on certain segments on the other side. And I was listening to the account that Greg was describing, and it appeared as if there was a deliberate attempt to sort of distribute the blame, because every time you have a crowd coming in when military can do the job, then it's basically an attempt to cover yourself legally and saying that, look, it was just the crowd and they were not acting on our orders. So my question is that based on the work that you have done, how successful do you think this report would be in pinpointing certain elements within the government or the military? Thank you.
No, those are great points. And I think that's exactly right. We've seen in other areas, in other countries, when there's genocide, crimes against humanity, there's always the use of civilians or a militia group that, we don't know anything about this group. We don't know how they're doing, when really they're providing the training, the direction, the arms, everything they need to get the job done, right? And so that won't help the leaders in this situation, not the least of which under the concept of command responsibility, which is they knew or should have known. So either they're directing it, or through their experience, through the reports coming into the field, there's a lot that went on Facebook. They knew or should have known. And so it's not going to excuse the culpability of the higher-ups and the Miramar military.
I would simply add in, again, I think that there isn't an excuse, as Dr. Noon said here, for the behavior. But when, again, it's carefully documented in this way, and as we looked at, if you see the parsing of the report, they talked first about the longer-term period leading up to the conflict. So you could see, in some ways, how they were preparing their space to carry out an operation like this. And so it was setting the community in a position where they would be able to exercise control. And that takes a large amount of concerted effort to do that, to be able to ensure, as I think you saw in some of the facts, they removed anything that could be considered to be a weapon from anyone's homes. They did put the people in a weaker position where they were deprived of food and other things to survive. They put them in a vulnerable emotional position by putting a lot of restrictions in place, from marriages to birth numbers in comparison with the broader population. And so as you see that entire campaign to sort of soften up the place, the area here, in order to be able to come in and then take control over a series of, as it became 2 intense months, 6 weeks of intense time period. But the leading up acts, I think, are also indicative, not just the command responsibility element, which will help them in a legal, which will not shield them in a legal context, but it requires the concerted effort of a state and a surrounding area to put all of those factors in place. And because of that, it minimizes arguments that there is some big uprising they have to immediately come in and quell, because clearly this was a systematic, prepared effort versus a immediate military response to an uprising of some sort. So I really do think when you read through the words of all parts of the report, you'll see how this was taking place.
Yeah, let me add one fact briefly. They not only removed all the weapons, they removed all the fences. So they took down all the fences in the community so they would not reach any defensive positions. And that was another fact that really struck us with the preparatory work and preparing to go.
We have a question here. Sage.
Thanks. 2 questions, actually. Uri Blau from Haaretz, Israel. Nina mentioned the protocol, and I'm curious if you can elaborate a little bit about what the protocol is. How do you build it for questionnaire, right, to interviewees? And also about the interviewees themselves. Are they identified? Do you record them, film them? And the database, is it open to the public or to other groups if they would want to use it at a later stage?
Let's take the second one.
Yeah, I'm actually going to suggest that Milica answer this because I can talk about the theory and she will tell you how it worked.
Okay. Yeah, so the protocol that we talked about is actually very big and elaborate, and I don't want to bother you with all the details, but the focus was what I was telling you about, the aim to collect over 1,000 statements and to do it randomly. And what I mentioned, it involved a lot of tools being used, so ensuring the security of our investigators, preparing deployment plans. We had a certain amount of time, so this was trying to get this done before the monsoon season. We had a goal of over 1,000. We needed to go to all of these areas. Based on demographic data of the camps, we determined how many interviews were needed in each of these sections. And then, as I said, we used satellite imagery to develop these walking patterns within a camp. All the investigators were divided into teams of 2. We put a lot of effort into ensuring gender balance in order to have female investigators available to interview female interviewees, especially if we came across cases of sexual and gender-based violence. All these teams of investigators were also teamed up with interpreters that we trained. This was before the deployment of the investigation mission. As Nina said, we had an expert in field interpretation who worked on criminal investigations of the ICC. And also, all of these teams had local guides who would navigate throughout the camps. And then finally, with experts in statistics, we were actually provided with a plan on how to ensure randomness when in the camp. It's called this left-hand rule. Basically, I don't want to go into all of these technicalities, but it's a very elaborate system. We had to track, all of the investigators were tracked through this satellite app to ensure that they spread out through the camps, and we were able to monitor where they were in order not to go to the same place again and to be sure to spread out and reach the largest sample of the population. And that's just a bit of the story. Then when we talk about interviewees, a key part of developing this questionnaire, the questionnaire was like a 15-page document. It was really what I was mentioning, a hybrid. It's a mix of what a statistical survey would look like. So you had key questions, but all of them were open-ended. So that's where the expertise of the investigators comes in, where they're able to walk the interviewee through these open-ended questions. And of course, these questions were, because we had a post-2016 sort of time frame, it was focused on why did they leave. So they describe the circumstances. As I think everyone mentioned, we weren't collecting hearsay. So only what the interviewee witnessed themselves, and we had specific questions relating to SGBV. We had questions on any on the perpetrators, and this is of course from the perspective of victims. So it's a very limited amount of information. Usually, it's information on insignia, any other identifiers. In very rare instances, they were able to identify perpetrators personally, and this was usually very low-level armed forces who were usually around the village and the area. But a large part of the questionnaire was the informed consent. The security of our interviewees was crucial. Having them feel comfortable with their information being shared or not. They all have the option of remaining anonymous. Actually, none of them wanted to be anonymous. They all said that if this information were to be used for any accountability efforts, they want this information to be out there and they want their name to be attached to it. However, that's sort of one level of, I'd say, their informed consent. The second level is that we remain the gatekeepers. So this is in reference to your second question. what's with the database, is it open? It is not open because of the sensitivity of this data. However, we did envisage sharing this information. Of course, if there was an accountability mechanism set up, we are happy to discuss sharing this. We have talked about sharing it with, for example, museums, sharing it with law clinics. There were already discussions of this kind. And most probably the way this would be shared would be through anonymizing the information, because it's a separate sheet of paper that's even stored in separate ways in order to ensure the protection of the data. So I hope this, and this is a short version of the answer.
This is Melissa being brief. Okay, we have time for one more quick question. If there's yes, go ahead. Microphone before.
Thank you. Jordan Tannen from Senator Markey's office. What can Congress do with this information? What recommendations do you have for them?
Who would like to take that?
You're the president.
Nina?
As a former congressional staffer.
That's why I'm looking in your direction, Nina.
8 years. You can read it, synthesize it for them. I think, a lot of members of Congress know about the Rohingya problem, but they are briefed by people who present them with different facts. So it would be great if there were a hearing in which people who have the report can come and speak. I'm sure we would make ourselves available for a staff briefing, that sort of thing. And that's the way, as you know very well, things move.
Great. Well, thank you for taking the time on a Monday morning. We appreciate you coming.